Our dish is my summer vegetable gratin, and that brings up the question, what exactly is a gratin? So I did a little research and kind of went back through my recipes. A gratin is something baked and or broiled in a shallow dish with a crisp topping, which is traditionally cheese or breadcrumbs, or in this case, cheese and breadcrumbs. I thought that I'm skipping the dish tonight though, but you could always make this recipe in a shallow dish, and I did put that in the recipe. The best known gratin dish in probably ever is potatoes gratin or potatoes au gratin. This delicious dish has layers of creamy potatoes and cheese and butter and cheese. So I tend to think of a gratin as some sort of layered vegetable dish, but technically even a baked mac and cheese, like the one we're making in the cooking club next week, could be called a gratin because it's topped with cheese and breadcrumbs and it's baked in a shallow dish. So suffice it to say the term gratin is kind of flexible. So I bake some of my gratin recipes with cream, yay, but this recipe, no cream. It relies on the moisture of the vegetables to bind the layers together. And this is the reason I wanted to see all of the colors of the cooked vegetables. Also, I didn't want to mask any of the flavor of the vegetables and textures of the vegetables with cream. I'm okay with cheese, but not cream this time. So you can certainly make this gratin in a baking dish, but I'm going to use oiled parchment paper because I absolutely love the rustic presentation, and you'll see what I mean in a minute. Okay, let's start with the topping though. So I have here some panko, and this is 1.5 cups of panko, which is Japanese breadcrumbs. They're nice and crunchy, and they're larger than traditional breadcrumbs, so they have a wonderful, wonderful crunch to them. And then this is 1 cup of grated Parmesan. And I like Parmesan in this recipe because of its nutty flavor. I think, I don't have it in front of me, but I think I also call out Asiago because Asiago is one of my favorite cheeses and would work well with this as well. But the nuttiness of the Parmesan is wonderful, and that's what I'm smelling in the air right now. Then I have 3 tablespoons, that's a lot of thyme leaves, and they're chopped. So basically I took them all off the stems. I got these, by the way, from Dean's Gardens at the Minneapolis Farmers Market, and I bought this huge bunch, I think it was $3, huge bunch, like a month ago, and I've been using it almost every day, and I just finally went through it. So I chopped them up, took them off. The smaller stems I kept in and chopped those as well. The large center stems, I pulled all of the leaves and smaller stems off of that. Chopped them up, 3 tablespoons, lots of thyme, but that is going to be wonderful. Okay, and then I have some Malden sea salt. I need a teaspoon of some type of coarse sea salt. It's going to add a little bit of crunch, and then some freshly ground black pepper. I'm going to say 1/2 teaspoon. I usually never measure pepper because I always grind it fresh. And I probably grind more than 1/2 teaspoon, but I love pepper. And then I just mix this up. I like using a whisk to do this. I have a little whisk that I use for anything small like this. Make sure you give this a little time to get that salt and everything distributed evenly. And you can kind of visually see what that's going to be because you have all of that thyme in there. THYME in there. Okay. Great. Now let's set this aside and talk about the actual gratin, and I don't think I'm going to need this cutting board anymore. So here I have a baking sheet with oiled parchment paper, about 1 tablespoon of olive oil, and I just spread that around like that. And then I'm going to, let's see, best place to put this is right here, Mark? How about like that?
That's fine.
Okay. So I already I peeled and ran through my mandolin 2 Yukon Gold potatoes. So those are there. Because I did them earlier, I held them in ice water so that they would not discolor. And actually, cold water is fine, doesn't have to be ice water. But I just, by habit, put them in ice water. And you can see what happens when you do that. They firm up, it kind of like that. So if I were gonna fry these would be great, but I'm not. But anyway, so we're gonna just put them on water. I wanna get rid of that excess moisture. Put them on paper towels and pat those dry. And then on my oiled parchment paper, I'm gonna start to build a kind of rectangle. And the one I just did that's in the oven is a little smaller than 9 by 13. In the recipe I say 9 by 13, which I never measure, I just kind of eyeball it, but I kind of like the height. And these, by the way, once this cooks down, they'll flatten out, so don't worry about the fact that they were held in water and they're kind of standing up, but that's fine. Won't affect what we're doing ultimately. So I'm building a little rectangle here, and this is my base. And I mentioned, by the way, that you can make this, of course, you can make this in a 9 by 13 baking dish, which is actually easier to do because you don't have to worry about the stacking, and things tend to slide a little bit when you do it this way. But again, I love this presentation, so that's why I'm going with this. Let me set this back here and get a few more paper towels to dry these off. I don't mind some moisture, but I just don't want these to be soaking wet. And then let's go for a second layer. There we go.
So you don't need to pre-cook the potatoes?
No, the potatoes do not need to be pre-cooked, but when we move on here to the yams, they do need to be pre-cooked. And the reason is, when we were doing all of this testing, because I test all of these recipes to make sure everything is actually working, what we wound up finding is that always the yams would be undercooked, or at least not quite as cooked as we wanted them. And I'm gonna go ahead and glove up for this. So what I decided to do, and this works perfectly, is put these in a bowl or a dish, whatever you wanna do, that you can cover, and I use saran wrap on top. A couple tablespoons of water, and then I microwaved them for 4 minutes after they were sliced, peeled and sliced. Did all this slicing, by the way, on a mandolin, just because it's fast and convenient and accurate. Just be careful when you're doing it. But anyway, so this pre-cooking of these solved the problem, but the potatoes are fine. And here's the weird thing: if you're just baking a potato and you're baking a yam, the yam bakes much more quickly than the potato will. Like maybe 25 minutes, and you can serve that yam. Tops 30 minutes, but a potato takes over an hour to bake, same temperature. So why on earth they don't in the gratin? The yam is the thing that is the last thing, and the potatoes are cooking fine. I have no idea, but anyway, the potatoes were always fine when we were testing it, but the yams weren't. So that's why the pre-cooking of those, and it's pretty easy to do. But it's just nice to not have, to keep putting it back in the oven waiting for the yams to cook. So thank you for that question, Mark. Okay, so I'm just layering these. And I know I'm gonna, just judging by what I've got going on here, they're gonna be a couple thick, a couple deep as I'm going around. And the trick too with this, aside from the sliding, which happens, you kind of keep making it go back in shape. But the trick is also, you want to try really hard to get out to the center there. Okay, and I know one thing I totally forgot to do, but I'm going to make up for it right now, is salt and pepper and put some of that topping on. So, but I'm going to make up for it. Get rid of that. So, for each layer, which I should have done, but I was talking and I didn't, but you should do a little salt and pepper. Now, building flavor, this is a great example of doing it. You want to, I'm just going to tighten this up a little bit. Okay. So what you want to do is not put a ton of salt in one place. You want to add it in layers. So it goes throughout the dish and you're kind of adding and building that flavor as you go. Now, because I forgot to do, because I was talking, the first layer, I'm going to do this. I'm going to put my 1/3 of a cup here, and I'll be a little more generous. Let's do a little bit more. But then what I'm going to do, and this is going to help with keeping it on the sides from sloping down, I'm just going to add a little bit under the side pieces here to build up. And that's how I will get the rest of my topping incorporated. And what this topping does is add flavor, but it also absorbs some of the moisture that you naturally get from these vegetables kind of steaming as you cook them, because we're going to cover everything. So that's another thing that these breadcrumbs do and the cheese does. Okay, perfect. There, I made up for that. So you can see that if you forget something, no problem. So the next layer is the red onions. I'm going to put some gloves on for this, mainly because they're onions and they're really strong. I wrote about red onions in my newsletter today because my dad used to make onion sandwiches. They weren't always red onions, but he would eat these slices on bread. I don't know what else was in them, but of just slices of onions. And I remember as a kid being just like, what are you doing? Oh, gross, that kind of thing. And but then I came to realize, as an adult, how wonderful onions are. And I started, pickling them and adding spices to them. They're always in salads. They're wonderful in sandwiches. And red onions, a little goes a long way. But they are delicious. And what I love in this dish is they don't quite get soft. They don't quite give it up, even though they're baked for quite a long time. They don't quite give it up. So you still have a little bit of that crunch, and you have a little bit of that almost bite that red onions have, which I really, really like. Okay, so let's keep going here. But they will cook down. So, this is one medium-sized, probably a little on the large-sized red onion. Like that. Thinly sliced. Okay, now I'm going to remember my salt and pepper on this layer. Just a little salt, and try to tighten this up so I could get this. There we go. That's much better. A little bit of pepper. The thing with these kinds of pepper grinders is the tighter that you screw them together, the finer the grind. And I had just replaced the peppercorns, so I was getting cracked pepper, not ground pepper. But there we go. Okay, I think that looks good. And then, of course, my 1/3 of a cup. And what's cool about this is that everything that I don't put in the gratin is going to go on the gratin. I'm not sure if I'm smelling the fresh ingredients or if I'm just smelling what's coming out of the oven or what's going on here, but it smells great. Okay, so now we've got a summer squash. I already sliced this about 1/8 of an inch thick. Did use a mandolin for that. We have a zucchini we're going to slice up, so you'll be able to see that. And again, I'm not being too careful about this, so because the whole thing is going to get smashed together, so it's not like making a pear tart where everything has to be perfect. But I am trying to kind of keep an eye on going out to the sides. Won't be able to, with this rustic version, get all the way out there, but I'm giving it a pretty good effort. And again, if you were using a baking dish, no problem, you'd be able to go right to the edge, which is a little easier. Okay. Okay, now what are we going to do now? Again, salt and pepper. Just a little bit of salt. And it's funny, I have become so much more liberal with pepper usage than I used to, and I almost never measure it, but I definitely am grinding a lot more than I used to. I've come to really love it. I think the dish that turned me on that was cacio e pepe, which is really peppery, and it was just, like pepper in the forefront instead of pepper being that seasoning that you just always do, but you don't really care about. Pepper in the forefront is just wonderful, so I use a lot more than I used to. Okay, and here's our third of a cup. Just distribute that. I don't care if it gets on the parchment paper. It's a rustic presentation, right? What are you gonna do? Okay. So that is that. What is next here? I think I have zucchini. Okay. Can I move this over here for a second? Okay, so here's my zucchini, and I'm going to just cut this off. Let me do it this way. I took my cutting board away, so I'll get rid of that. And I've got a mandolin here. And this mandolin, this is probably a $30 purchase, and if I were doing it, but it's very sharp, so don't let the price fool you. I've gone through a lot of these, but they're nice because they're light and they're really easy to use. They're easy to clean. They go in your dishwasher, so I do have a metal mandolin that takes a little bit to set up, harder to clean, can't go in my dishwasher, so I use that less and less all the time. But just don't be fooled, this is super sharp. If I were doing anything else, like when I was doing the onion and the potatoes and the yam, I wore a glove, a protective glove, so that I wouldn't slice my hand. With this, I'm not going to, because I'm going to get down to the end and my hand won't be exposed. But just be very, very careful when you're using these. And I always, with this, because it has some flexibility to it, I always hold it like this with my thumb, pressing down so that I'm sure that the slices come out even. And then another tip is, as you go along, keep turning your vegetable so that you can get nice round slices like that. Otherwise they start to elongate. And just be careful as you're going down, as I said. Keep your hand away from it. Anything gets stuck, just pull it through. Turn that around as the bowl gets full. Okay, keep going. Almost there. And notice again, I keep turning it, and that's just to keep the slices nice and round, otherwise they start to get long. That's just a function of how they go through the mandolin. All right, that looks good. Let's get rid of that. And then these guys go on. Now I'm gonna just kind of start with my corners and build this up a little bit. You can see it starts to slide a little bit, but that's okay. Look at all those colors. Is that gorgeous or what? Love this time of year. There's so much to work with. And there's still so much at the market. So these zucchinis and yellow squash, well, the zucchini is from Untied's. The yellow squash, I'm not sure where I got them. I picked them up at the last minute. The onions I've had on hand. I bought those at the market about a few weeks ago. So those, of course, keep. But there are onions all over the market. Yes?
We lost the connection for just a second, but it's back now. And but there was a question about the bottom layer. That was Yukon Gold potatoes.
It was Yukon Gold potatoes, and if you can't get Yukon Golds, I would use red potatoes. They're not as starchy as like a russet, which would break apart, so they hold together really nicely. So either or would work really well. It's a great question. And I'm sorry we lost the connection. Did that do anything to us? Like give us a whole new feed or something? You don't know, do you? Who knows?
I don't question
we're still here. Oh, the world of technical difficulties. We have all this technology and it works a good solid 80% of the time, and then 10% of the time we just go, okay, we're back. Okay, down my little salt and pepper. And then I'm going to do another. So, you know, if this were in a 9x13, this would be flatter. But trust me, this will cook. This is almost as tall as the one I did this afternoon. So it cooks down, it cooks fine, so don't be concerned about that. Okay, last thing I do need, my cutting board for this. I've got basil, roughly a cup. I'm gonna do this on a small cutting board, which is what I love doing because it doesn't mess up my big cutting board. So I have these little cutting boards around. I should mention I buy these guys at Eversharp Kitchen Store in Northeast Minneapolis because I love them, and they carry these great little cutting boards, and they also engraved this beautiful knife for me, and they sharpen all my knives, which I am definitely due for. But anyway, I like little cutting boards because then I can do something small like this and not have to get another large cutting board out. And I'm really talking rough chop here. As a matter of fact, some of these leaves are so small I won't even have to chop them. Okay, let's do that. And then this goes right over the top of the entire thing. Honestly, I feel like I'm making a vegetable altar or something. This is funny. And, you know, the other thing I was thinking about is and I say this all the time, I always tell people prep everything ahead of time. Separate your prep from your assembly. Separate your prep from your assembly and your cooking. You know, separate your steps and be prepared. But in this dish, I'm doing very little actual cutting and chopping live. And yet, look, you know, I'm still doing quite a bit. So this is one of those dishes where it'll be a whole lot more fun to make and serve if you do all of your prep and then do your assembly, and you'll remember what you're doing. Okay, so last but not least, we've got 2 tomatoes, and these are actually from my garden. And I got my little plants that grew these tomatoes from Dean's Gardens. I don't know if they're still selling plants. I think they're now doing herb plants for fall, and of course they always have fantastic herbs and greens and all of that. I'll just put this over here. I think I just hit your camera. Is it okay? Okay. Sorry about that. Oh, and I love using, this is a strawberry huller, but that's how I take the stem part out of a tomato. Works really well. And I'm using a serrated knife, and I'm just going to slice these into roughly 1/4 inch slices. And I think in the picture that we posted of this, I actually used cherry tomatoes from the garden because I still have cherry tomatoes, but I have more than we can deal with. So, and they're wonderful. So I topped the whole thing with cherry tomatoes, which of course rolled all over the place, but I got it done. I definitely got it done. So again, about 1/4 inch thick, like that. I'm just gonna take this little end off here so it'll lay flat. Okay. And then let's put these up on top. I'm gonna have a little sliding going on here, so I'm gonna have to try really hard to get these to stay in place. And this last layer, we're not doing any salt and pepper because once we put this in the oven and let it, okay, come on guys. Once we put this in the oven, I'm gonna get this done. Don't worry, because if they're sliding, I'm gonna put parchment paper on top, so I'll get them in place, put the parchment paper on top and work fast. Okay, so, but once this is in the oven and has baked for an hour, and the temperature is 350 degrees, by the way, what you want to do is take it out, and we'll show that in a second here as soon as I get this wrapped up. You take it out, and then you'll put more topping, what's left of the topping, or as much as you want on top. Okay. Pretty good, huh? I'm gonna tuck this under here. So again, if I were using a regular baking dish, I wouldn't have sliding tomatoes, but I think this is worth it because it's so pretty. All right, let me get rid of this. Don't anyone breathe. Okay, so we're gonna take this piece of parchment paper. This is not oil, doesn't have to be. And I'm gonna put this over the top and then just press everything down. And this is the part where I'm telling this gratin that it all needs to stick together. And I had one tomato slide, so I'm gonna put them back up there and press on it. If I were doing this in a baking dish, I would still do this pressing just to get those layers started adhering together. But of course it wouldn't be as critical in terms of just keeping the whole thing together. Then I'm going to grab some aluminum foil. Nice large sheet of that, and I'm going to cover the entire thing. Okay, so you've got my little movie to show, Mark?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to put this in the oven at 350 degrees for an hour. Now we're going to show you what happens after that hour. There we go. Okay, so I'm taking the foil off, and there's my parchment paper. Look at that. Okay, so this is not totally cooked through though, even after an hour. And I'm putting what's left, I think I didn't use quite all of it, of the panko mixture on top. There we go. Replacing a tomato that slid away. So you just can't stop that. And now I'm not covering it. I'm just putting it back in the oven, uncovered. And there you go. Okay, so this is after an additional 20 minutes, and here this is. This has been sitting in the oven, but it's not super hot anymore. I let it cool down. And by the way, you'll want to let it cool down anyway before you serve it. You don't want to take it right out of the oven and try to cut it. It will fall apart. But if you give it a little bit of time, that's always a good thing. So let me just slide this onto my cutting board like that. How crazy that is. And I can lift that, that's fine. Then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to slice, maybe I just slice a portion of this off so you can see what the layers look like. Oh, and one thing I should mention, usually the parchment isn't this discolored, but I forgot to oil it. Busy afternoon, so what I did was I sprayed a little bit of oil so that the edges would release, which is always a good idea. A little bit of canola oil and cooking spray. Ordinarily I would do it with olive oil and it would brown a little more evenly. But that was my stopgap measure to make sure that I could get it off of the parchment paper. So even just doing the edges helps release it. Okay. Oh, it smells so good. Okay, so, oh, there we go. It's all good. So can you see my little layers there? How pretty that is? Look at that. Isn't that gorgeous? Dinner. Okay, do I have any questions?
What other vegetables would work with it?
What other vegetables would work with this? Well, I mean, the sky's the limit, and particularly now with all of these fall vegetables. But I did have a cooking club member, Lisa. If you're watching, Lisa, hello. Lisa made this whole scenario with, I think she said she used eggplant. I can't remember if there was something else, but she used eggplant. And what I didn't ask her was whether she salted the eggplant before she put it in, just to draw some of that moisture out. But anyway, she made it with eggplant and she loved it. But this time of year, boy, there are lots of choices. I mean, there's going to be kohlrabi, there's going to be rutabaga, which would be really good in this because it's got that kind of peppery sweet flavor. Any type of potato-y thing. You don't want to use the yam, you could use sweet potatoes instead. Very, very similar. I probably would par cook those as well, just like we did with the yams. Lots of different choices in potatoes. You know, I mentioned before that a russet is probably the least friendly for this type of thing because it will just break apart. But there are, purple potatoes and other kinds of more waxy potatoes available at the market that would work really well. As, I think too, possibly even a turnip. I mentioned rutabaga, right? And kohlrabi. So lots of options. You can kind of just make it up as you go. The first time I made this chart, I mentioned cherry tomatoes, but the first time I had heirlooms. And it was almost painful to put the topping on it because they were so beautiful. So work with what you have. This is one of those recipes where that works really, really well. I know when the pandemic started, we were just substituting pretty much, anything for anything. And now we've reined that in because food is absolutely so available. But, with this type of a recipe, any type of a gratin where you're baking something like this, you can just kind of make it up as you go. But that brings up a point that I wanted to bring up in terms of par cooking things. I have a gratin recipe that it's not like a typical gratin. It's more like a leek potato type of thing. But I had trouble with the potatoes because the whole thing would brown and bubble up, especially if I made it in quantities before the potatoes cooked. And I started par cooking those as well. And those, just because of the nature of it, I did use russets in those sometimes in that recipe. But I had trouble with that, so I par cooked them. So if you are having trouble somewhere with getting everything done on time, just look at that vegetable that's causing you trouble or being a problem, and then you can just do what I did with the yams, and that really helps.
Could you make this in a springform pan or a regular dish, and then would that affect the cooking time?
If you make it in a baking dish or a spring form. A spring form, it's not, okay, so a form would help, in terms of if you wanted to make it and then lift it, and so that would help keep it, so you could get all the way to the side. So that would be a nice presentation too. Baking time won't be affected. I mean, it's an hour and 20 minutes either way. Well, listen, everyone, thank you so much for watching tonight. I really hope you make my summer vegetable gratin. By the way, the recipe, if you don't have it already, is on my website, bonicellicookingclub.com. Take a look at that offer. Go to the farmer's market this weekend, buy all this stuff, and make this recipe. Say hello to everyone. It's going to be a fun treat. They're really, really doing well for fall. It's gorgeous. So thank you, everyone. Have a great night, and we'll see you next week. Ciao.